Picture a coastline where black volcanic sand turns white within a few steps, where thousands of penguins nest just meters from grazing sheep, and the wind never really stops moving across empty green hills. It looks like the kind of place no one's ever heard of. Untouched, forgotten, entirely its own world. And yet this same island has been invaded, fought over, and claimed by Argentina, who as recently as 2026 was still waving a banner about it at the World Cup. For most of us, this island exists only as a name attached to an old war, not a place where people actually live, work, and build entire lives. Welcome to the story of the Falkland Islands, the British territory that's never stopped being fought over. The Falkland Islands are home to roughly 3,500 people, and, by most estimates, several times that number in sheep. That single ratio says almost everything about how this place works before a single historical fact comes up. Spread across territory close to the size of Northern Ireland, the population isn't clustered into one dense town. Most people live in Stanley, the capital, while the rest are scattered across rolling grassland, known locally as camp, where farms can sit hours apart by road. When I first checked the numbers, I assumed the sheep comparison was some exaggerated line for tourists. It isn't. Sheep farming for wool has been the backbone of the local economy for generations, and the animals still outnumber residents by a wide margin across barely 4,700 square miles of land. What's stranger is how ordinary this feels to the people who actually live there. There's no sense of frontier hardship in how islanders describe their daily routines. Just quiet acceptance that this is simply what scale looks like when a few thousand people are spread across a territory this size, thousands of miles from the nearest stretch of familiar coastline, and still call it home without a second thought. So how does a community this small and this far from everywhere actually function day to day? That's the question that pulled me into this story in the first place. The Falklands aren't some abandoned outpost running on the bare minimum. They're a fully operating, self-sustaining community with schools, a hospital, shops, and regular flights and supply routes connecting them to the outside world. What makes it remarkable isn't survival, it's normalcy. People go to work, raise families, and build entire lives on a piece of land most of the world couldn't locate on a map, thousands of miles from the country whose flag flies over it. The nearest major landmass, Argentina, sits only a few hundred kilometers away, closer than London is to most of continental Europe, while the UK itself is roughly 13,000 kilometers in the other direction. That gap between where the islands sit and who they belong to is the strange core of everything that follows in this story. Not a place struggling to exist, but one that's quietly figured out how to thrive somewhere it, on paper, shouldn't. From above, the Falkland Islands look deceptively simple. Two main islands, East and West Falkland, surrounded by roughly 750 smaller ones, all sitting in the cold reach of the South Atlantic. But land here is shaped by conditions that would exhaust most places. Near constant wind, a treeless, rolling terrain covered in tussock grass and peat bog, and a climate that stays cool and damp through every season, rather than swinging between extremes. There's no real summer heat and no harsh winter freeze, just a steady, blustery in-between that defines everything from how houses are built to how roads are laid out across camp, the term islanders use for anywhere outside Stanley. What struck me looking into this is how much the geography itself explains the population pattern from the last chapter. With almost no natural shelter from the wind and soil poorly suited to large-scale farming beyond grazing, the land practically dictated that people would spread thin and stay small in number. The coastline, meanwhile, is dramatic in a different way. Deep inlets, rocky cliffs, and beaches that shift from black volcanic sand to pale white within a short drive, giving the islands a visual range that their flat, empty-looking interior doesn't hint at. What actually makes the land feel alive isn't the terrain itself, it's what lives on it. The Falklands host one of the largest concentrations of breeding seabirds and marine mammals anywhere in the South Atlantic, with 5 different penguin species nesting along the coastline, including king, gentoo, rockhopper, and Magellanic penguins, some in colonies numbering in the tens of thousands. Elephant seals and sea lions haul out on the same beaches, often within walking distance of farmhouses, and black-browed albatross colonies cling to the cliffs in numbers rarely seen outside a handful of remote islands worldwide. When I looked into how residents interact with this, the answer wasn't tourism brochure distance. Wildlife here isn't kept behind a barrier, it's simply part of the same land people farm and live on. Sheep graze meters from penguin colonies, fishing boats share bays with sea lions, and self-sufficiency runs alongside all of it. Much of the island's food, energy and water systems are built around working with this exposed, wind-driven environment rather than against it. From wind power generation to small-scale local farming, suited to short growing seasons. It's a landscape that never needed to be tamed to become livable. People simply learned to build their routines around what was already thriving there. Here's the part that turns this from a quiet island story into an international flashpoint. On April 2nd, 1982, Argentine forces invaded the Falkland Islands, asserting a sovereignty claim that dated back to the 1800s, and occupied the territory for 74 days before a British task force sailed roughly 13,000 kilometers to retake it. The conflict was short but brutal. 649 Argentine service members, 255 British service members, and 3 Falkland Islanders lost their lives before the fighting ended in June 1982 with Argentina's surrender. What's easy to miss, looking at the islands today, is how directly this war still shapes daily life described in earlier chapters. The sparse population, the careful land use, even the presence of British military personnel on the islands, all trace back to this single 10-week conflict decades ago. It's fully documented, extensively covered, and not remotely ambiguous in outcome. And it still doesn't fully make sense that a dispute this old, over a territory this small and this remote, escalated into a war involving 2 national militaries crossing an ocean to fight over it. That contradiction between the scale of the islands and the scale of the response is what makes this chapter of their history so difficult to look away from. So how does a war from 1982 end up back in the headlines more than 40 years later? On July 15, 2026, Argentina beat England 2-1 in the World Cup semi-final in Atlanta. And within moments of the final whistle, defender Lisandro Martinez and substitute Giovanni Lo Celso unfurled a banner on the pitch reading, "Las Malvinas son Argentinas," Spanish for, "The Falklands are Argentina's." The gesture immediately reignited a diplomatic argument that most assumed belonged to history books, not football stadiums. Argentine President Javier Milei called the players' celebration perfectly valid, saying it reflected a sentiment shared by all Argentinians, even while acknowledging FIFA would likely fine the team over it. FIFA opened a formal investigation, citing its own rules against political displays inside stadiums, and the incident drew responses from British officials as well. What makes this genuinely strange isn't that the dispute exists. It's that a sovereignty argument, rooted in a 19th century claim and a 1982 war, can still surface, unresolved, in front of a global television audience in 2026. The islands themselves haven't changed in that time. The argument over who they belong to clearly hasn't settled either. After a war and a World Cup controversy, it's easy to forget the Falklands are still, first and foremost, a working community of about 3,500 people, and one with an economic reality most countries would envy. Unemployment sits at close to zero, with many islanders holding more than one job across farming, fishing, tourism, and public services just to keep the small economy running smoothly. The population itself is more mixed than the British outpost label suggests. Islanders who identify simply as Falkland Islander make up roughly 52%, alongside about 37% who identify as British, and smaller but established communities of St. Helenian, Filipino, and Chilean residents, each filling specific roles in the workforce, from fishing fleets to hospitality. When I looked into how a community this size sustains itself without the safety net of a nearby city, the answer kept coming back to necessity. With no large labour pool to draw from, nearly everyone of working age is employed, often in more than one role, simply because the islands can't function otherwise. It's a small, self-contained economy where labor scarcity isn't a crisis. It's just the baseline condition everyone plans around. With no large city nearby to offer entertainment, healthcare backup, or social infrastructure, the Falklands rely on something smaller and more direct, an unusually dense network of local clubs and volunteer groups. Stanley's Leisure Centre alone supports swimming, hockey, badminton, netball, indoor football, bowls, table tennis and volleyball, while golf, full-bore target shooting, cricket, running, archery and athletics round out the options beyond it. Youth organisations including Rainbows, Brownies, Scouts and Girl Guides run alongside sports clubs and conservation groups, giving young islanders structured activities despite the population being too small to support commercial alternatives. What struck me digging into this is how much these clubs function as actual infrastructure, not just hobbies. In a community this size, a sports league or a scout troop isn't a leisure add-on, it's one of the only ways people regularly connect outside their immediate households and workplaces. Volunteer-run conservation groups add another layer, given how closely daily life sits alongside the wildlife covered earlier. There's no version of the Falklands that works through anonymity or crowds. Every part of community life here depends on the same few thousand people showing up for each other, repeatedly, because there's simply no one else to do it.